On a cold lab screen, under the white glow of a monitor, a strange number appears where there should be messier variety. Modern human DNA looks too similar, similar enough that geneticists infer a past genetic bottleneck, a moment somewhere between 60,000 and 100,000 years ago, when the breeding population may have dropped to only a few thousand. That is the present-day clue. Not a legend, not a crater, not a dramatic sky full of ash. A pattern in living people, here, now. And once that pattern was recognized, science went looking for an event large enough to explain it. One candidate towered above the rest. The Toba supereruption, and the human genetic bottleneck seemed, for a long time, to fit together almost too neatly. A colossal eruption in Sumatra, and a species reduced to a narrow line of survivors. The problem is, neat answers are often where the real trouble begins. If you like careful, evidence-driven stories like this, subscribe and stay with me. That is where the numbers started to look dangerous. In Sumatra, the youngest Toba tuff eruption came out as a VEI-8 event, with about 2,800 cubic kilometers of material thrown into the air. On paper, it was the kind of eruption that could support a volcanic winter story. So Stanley Ambrose's 1998 paper in Journal of Human Evolution landed so hard. He lined up the ash, the climate model, and the genetic bottleneck, and the fit looked elegant enough to become the default explanation for years. Toba became the clean answer, the one that made two mysteries look like one event. But a clean answer is also a fragile one. If the eruption really drove a species-wide collapse, the record should show more than a date that happens to line up. It should leave marks in climate archives, in sediments, in human behavior, somewhere. And once researchers started checking those places, the story began to fray. In the Lake Malawi cores, the question stopped being abstract. A dark cylinder of mud, cut open in the lab, held a thin ash mark from Toba. Real material, not just a theory on paper. Christine Lane and her team published the result in PNS in 2013. That matters because Lake Malawi sits in a region the old model depended on. If a volcanic winter had bitten hard there, the layers above the ash should have shown a sharp climate break. They did not. The record was there, the ash was there, and the severe collapse people had expected was not. That does not erase the eruption, and it does not erase the genetic bottleneck. It only breaks the easy bridge between them, and once that bridge weakens, the next question gets harder. If East Africa did not fall the way the hypothesis predicted, then what exactly was Toba doing to human populations? And where else should the trail have left a mark? The second blow came from a place where the ash itself was underfoot. At Jwalapuram in India, researchers were not reading mud chemistry now, but stone and soil, hands in the trench, dust on tools, a visible tephra layer cutting across the site like a line drawn through time. In 2007, Michael Petralia and colleagues published in Science what made that place so difficult for the old model. Stone tool industries appeared below the ash and above it with no clear break, no obvious silence, no clean sign that one population vanished and a different one arrived after the eruption. That does not prove nothing happened. It does something more careful than that. It says the strongest version of the Toba story, eruption, collapse, human disappearance across whole regions, now had to survive direct archaeological continuity. So the picture was changing. In East Africa, the climate shock looked weaker than expected. In India, human activity seemed to continue through the fallout. And that meant the hypothesis was no longer standing on one leg, but two very shaky ones. By this point, the case had changed shape. Changed. Because the eruption was still real, and the genetic bottleneck was still real. What was failing was the straight line between them. That distinction matters more than it sounds. In science, two facts can sit side by side for years and still refuse to become a single story. Toba happened around 74,000 years ago. The narrowing in human ancestry falls somewhere in that broader late window. For a while, that overlap felt convincing enough. Then 2007 and 2013 arrived like cross-examination. Petralia's tools at Jwalapuram did not show the clean break the old model wanted. Lane's Lake Malawi record held the ash, but not the matching collapse. Different methods, different places, same problem. So now the hypothesis was on trial in a stricter way. Did the eruption happen? Yes. Was there a narrowing in our ancestry? Also, yes. The question had become much more uncomfortable. If Toba did not do the whole job, then what did? The next step was less dramatic, but in some ways more damaging. Once the first two blows landed, researchers had to look again at the timing itself, not the eruption date, which was firm enough, but the dating of the human narrowing. That older confidence had always leaned on a window, not a fingerprint. The genetic bottleneck sits somewhere in that broad range between 60,000 and 100,000 years ago. Toba falls inside it, but being inside the window is not the same thing as causing the event. And that is where the old certainty starts to slip through your fingers. A theory can feel solid because two timelines overlap. Then the overlap survives, but the mechanism does not. The ash in Lake Malawi and the continuity at Jwalapuram force exactly that kind of separation. So the trial becomes stricter again. It may have. The harder question is whether one eruption can still carry the full weight of the story, or whether the bottleneck was never one clean disaster in the first place. That possibility changes the whole tone of the mystery. Once the single cause story weakens, another idea moves into view. Maybe the narrowing signal in our DNA does not come from one clean collapse at all. A genetic bottleneck can look simple when you see it from the far end, thousands of generations later. But the past itself may not have been simple. Instead of one brutal moment with one cause, the pattern could reflect several contractions spread across time, with small human groups thinning, recovering, and thinning again. Notice what that does to Toba. It does not make the eruption irrelevant, it only removes its monopoly. The ash may still belong somewhere in the story, just not as the entire answer. And that is a harder story for the mind to hold. One blast, one winter, one survival line. That is easy. A long sequence of pressure, movement, and partial loss is much less tidy. But if that untidy version is closer to the truth, then the next question is unavoidable. Was the bottleneck shaped less by one catastrophe and more by where people went afterward? This is why the next argument turns on scale. A sediment core or a tephra layer can show that ash reached a place. It cannot, by itself, prove that people everywhere reacted the same way. So the old Toba story had to assume more than the rocks could actually say. It had to assume a volcanic winter strong enough to hit whole populations at once, not just leave a stain in the ground. And once Lake Malawi and Jwalapuram stopped matching that picture, the hypothesis had to narrow. Stanley Ambrose's idea in 1998 still mattered. It was never nonsense. It just had to answer a harder question now. If Toba did not flatten the whole human world, then why does the genetic bottleneck remain so sharp? This is the uncomfortable part. The ash is local. The genes are global. And somewhere between those two scales, the story is still missing a piece. At this stage, the case stopped being about a single impact and turned into a question of pressure over time. The Toba supereruption and the human genetic bottleneck no longer fit neatly as cause and effect. That shift matters because human history is not written in one layer at a time. A volcanic ash line can be sharp, visible, easy to date. A genetic bottleneck is different. It can reflect many small losses, spread out across generations, until the pattern looks sudden only from far away. That explanation began to thin. Ambrose's line still existed, but it now had to carry more weight than the evidence could comfortably give it. The ash was real. The bottleneck was real. The bridge between them was the part that kept failing under pressure. And once that bridge weakens, the whole scene opens up again. Not to a final answer, but to a wider field of possible causes. So the argument kept moving away from ash and toward populations. That is where the Toba supereruption and the human genetic bottleneck became harder to hold as one clean event. A volcanic winter can explain a sudden shock. It cannot, on its own, explain every later branch, every survival pocket, every regional difference in the record. So the bottleneck now looks less like a single cracked pane and more like pressure applied over a long stretch of time. You can see the problem in the evidence itself. A sediment core gives a layer. A DNA model gives a pattern. Neither one says, by itself, that the whole human world fell together at the same moment. So the question stops being, did Toba matter, and becomes something much less tidy. If the eruption was only one stress among several, which other pressures were already narrowing us? So the argument had to widen. By now, the Toba supereruption and the human genetic bottleneck were no longer linked by a simple line, but by a much messier field of pressure. So the remaining explanations started to matter more. A bottleneck can come from repeated regional losses, from movement into new places, from climate stress that lasts longer than one ashfall, or from small populations splitting and shrinking again. None of that needs one perfect disaster. It needs time and a lot of uncertainty. And that is the part that is hardest to hold on to. A single eruption gives you one date, one crater, one dramatic image. But a human population history can hide inside ordinary-looking survival, in places where nothing seems to break cleanly at all. So the hypothesis is no longer asking to be believed because it sounds elegant. It has to survive as evidence. And once you put it under that kind of light, the next question is not whether Toba was big. It is whether anything in the record was ever big enough to explain the bottleneck alone. That is where the competing ideas start to feel less like guesses and more like tests. If the narrowing came from repeated regional losses, then the map matters as much as the ash. One route points to movement out of Africa, where small groups could leave a strong genetic trace without any single global crash. Another points to climate stress that lasted longer than one eruption, with habitat edges shifting, opening, closing, and forcing people through narrow corridors again and again. Stanley Ambrose's Toba idea still sits inside that larger picture, but no longer at the center. The eruption may have been one hard blow among several. The bottleneck may be a record of pressure, not a record of one moment. And that changes what the evidence has to do. A sediment core can catch ash. A gene tree can catch ancestry. But to explain the whole pattern, the story now needs the movements between those points. And that is where the record gets thin. This is why the last candidate is the least tidy, and maybe the most important. If the narrowing happened while other Homo groups were still around, then the bottleneck was not just about weather or ash. It was also about who was sharing the landscape. In that frame, the eruption becomes one stress inside a crowded world. Small human groups already living near the edge would have been forced to move, adapt, or run into competitors for the same ground, the same water, the same shelter. A genetic bottleneck like that can leave a hard signature without leaving one clean disaster behind it. The old one-cause story keeps shrinking. The ash layer is still there. The DNA signal is still there. But now, the more interesting question is not whether one volcano erased almost everyone. It is how many other pressures were already squeezing the same populations at the same time, and which of them left the mark we read today. That is why the broader climate background keeps creeping back in. Once the single-cause story weakens, the late Pleistocene stops looking like a backdrop and starts looking like part of the mechanism. A genetic bottleneck does not need one clean catastrophe. It can form when rainfall shifts, habitats thin out, and routes that once stayed open begin to close. In that kind of pressure, groups can survive for a while, then shrink again, then recover, all without leaving one dramatic break in the ground. So the old Toba model has to compete with something less cinematic and more stubborn: volcanic winter, a long stretch of difficult living, several archives, not one answer, but a pattern that only appears when you compare them. And once that comparison starts, the real question is no longer which single event hit hardest. It is which pressures kept lining up just often enough to leave the signal we still see today. This is why competition has become part of the picture. If the bottleneck was not just climate, then the pressure may have come from other human groups already occupying the same landscape. In that reading, Toba is still there, but it is no longer alone. The ash falls on populations that are already small, already stretched, already moving through narrow paths. A genetic bottleneck can sharpen there without needing one universal disaster. And that makes the evidence feel different. A tephra layer can mark an eruption. It cannot tell you, by itself, whether people were also being squeezed by rivals, by migration, or by the slow loss of safe ground. The old story keeps losing pieces, one by one. What remains is not a clean replacement, but a more crowded scene. And the next question is whether the bottleneck was ever the result of one force at all. At this point, the story is less about proving one culprit than about sorting through overlap. A sediment core can tell you ash arrived. A DNA model can tell you the line got narrow. But neither one, by itself, says the same thing happened everywhere at once. That is why the older Toba argument feels so fragile now. It joined a local geological event to a global human pattern and treated the match as proof. Lake Malawi and Jwalapuram broke that shortcut, and the broader climate and competition models kept filling the gap. So the debate has settled into a harder shape. There was a bottleneck. Toba erupted. The live question is whether those two facts ever belonged to one chain, or whether we built the chain after the fact because it was the neatest way to tell the story. And if that chain is wrong, then the missing link is still waiting somewhere in the record. By now, the old single answer version has been reduced to a shape that is almost hard to recognize. The Toba supereruption and the human genetic bottleneck still stand, but the neat bridge between them does not. What remains is a more careful kind of uncertainty. A volcanic event can be enormous and still not explain a species-wide pattern on its own. A bottleneck can be real and still come from several forces acting together: climate, movement, competition, repeated local loss. That is the point the evidence keeps pushing toward. Just a record that refuses to line up as simply as the textbooks once hoped. And so, the last question is not about Toba alone anymore. It is about whether the missing cause was ever a single thing at all, or something spread across time that the record only shows in fragments. So the final verdict is narrower, and in a way, more impressive. The Toba super eruption and the human genetic bottleneck both remain standing. The eruption in Sumatra happened. The narrowing in our ancestry happened. What failed was the comfortable claim that one clean cause explained both. That is not a small correction. It changes the shape of the past. Instead of a single blow that neatly reduced humanity, the record points toward a world of overlapping strain. Ash in one archive, continuity in another, ancestry compressed into a pattern that refuses to name one culprit. A thin gray line in mud, a worked stone above it, another below. And between those two kinds of evidence, the old certainty gives way. Not because the past became empty, but because it became crowded. The lab light is still on. The core is still split open. The ash is still there. And the space between that ash and us is still not finished speaking.